This tutorial is part one of a two-part video series that will go through how to create this asset. We'll start in Maya to create the high poly model. This will cover a few different techniques that you can use for creating the source of a normal map bake. We'll then bake that onto a 2D plane inside of Maya. That'll let us go into Photoshop. We'll have a normal map as well as an ambient occlusion map, and we'll go through a few different techniques in the second video on how to texture that, just adding a few layers and a bit of grunge texture like in this video, this image here. And then at the end we'll assemble that inside of Unity 5. We'll add a self-illumination map down the bottom here, a couple of lights and bloom, and basically end up with this sort of result. So this will cover a few different techniques that you can use for any sort of generic sci-fi or industrial type panel, but more importantly it's a good way to sort of get into the whole normal map texture creation process. I'm going to start by importing an image. So this is just a reference image of a generic kind of panel. You could really use anything, you could improvise it, though there's a lot of reference out there, and I definitely recommend looking at existing content and finding some inspiration. So I've brought in an image and I've put it into the front view. Now I will just make a cube in the front view. The reason I went for a cube is that I'm going to be extruding this. Now I'll basically start cutting this up similar to the reference image. I actually realized in a minute, I'm recording this after I've done the video, it's a lot easier just to work in halves, so we'll see this in a second. But all I've done is extruded out the key shapes. It's very important, as you see there, I just scaled those in. It's very important for a normal map bake to make sure everything isn't just perfectly extruded out from the same shape of the face it was to start with. It needs to be scaled in a little bit so that when you look at it in an orthographic view, in this case the front view, it's very clear that there's some depth there. So as we can see here, we're looking in the front and it's very obvious there's a bit of depth. There's just no point extruding it out towards the camera and not scaling it. You would not see any sense of depth once you bake that normal onto the 2D plane. Yeah, here I've realized that it's perfectly symmetrical, so I'm not going to waste my time doing everything on either side twice. So I've just deleted half, and at the end I will duplicate that and merge them back together, mirror it. But really all it's a matter of is going through making the separate shapes. It's not like traditional modeling where you're trying to come away with a single model that is high quality. We can get away with some substandard modeling practices. A few n-gons aren't actually going to be a big deal, but of course best practice is always best to follow, so as much as possible I'm trying to keep it in quads. It will be subdivided, so if you hit 3 to smooth preview, I won't be subdividing just yet, but when you smooth it, you want to make sure it smooths nicely. It can hold control loops to control the shape of the subdivision. So I've modeled the first outline, primary shape, and now I'm doing some of the interior. I'll just break this up and extrude in that bottom section and then the top section. So I think we might just fast forward through this process. Here I'm just running a cleanup just to make sure. I just wanted to check if I had any problems, and I can see here there's a couple of edge loops that I didn't continue around. It's always important to run cleanup on your models. I did say earlier that it's not a big deal if there's some problem geometry, but in this case I'm trying to smooth it and it wasn't letting me insert bevels and edge loops. And so once I'm happy with the model, it's now a matter of inserting control loops. So that's what I'm doing here with these insert edge loop tools. I'm adding extra edge loops that flow through the geometry so that when I smooth it, it will maintain its somewhat square shape. It's squared corners. If I didn't do that, if I smoothed it, of course, it would just collapse into a bit of a mess. Very curved type shape. So we'll see in a moment. Basically, any edge loop, any corner that I want to retain as a hard surface needs to have that control loop. So here I've smoothed it, and I can see a couple of areas where it's still a bit too curved. When I say I smoothed it, of course, I've just hit 3 on the keyboard to get the smooth preview. So a few sections here that we need to add for some extra edge loops. Okay, so smoothing this corner, I'm not too happy with the shape of this. So it just needs a few control loops. Beveling that edge, it definitely cleaned out the shape, helps keep it nice and curved. So I'm just manually adjusting some of the verts there. And instead of beveling, I decided to insert edge loops that give it a very clean square curved, which was more of the effect I'm after. And I've noticed down the bottom here, there's a bit of a problem that's just ended up misaligned. So I'm just eyeballing this, but just basically moving those verts up, these verts in the corner here, so that corner looks nice and square. Here I've hit the insert key on the keyboard to move the center of pivot to the side, to the left, and snap that to the extreme leftmost vert, and then duplicated that over, flipped it, and I've merged these verts together. So fairly standard technique for duplicating, mirroring an object. Just doing a quick bit of cleanup. Making sure this whole thing smooths nicely, so I've got enough control loops in there to do so. Now I'm duplicating, mirroring the top section. This is going to let me build the indents. For the lights, I've just made some new extra cubes, just standalone cubes. All I've done is bevel these in and then extrude them in to create a sort of housing for a light source. Since it's such a low poly object, I've just beveled the whole model, and that smooths quite nicely, so then it's a matter of mesh smooth to make that permanent, rather than hitting 3, which is just a preview, so it's actually smoothed, subdivided. For these sort of panel things, I've simply made a cube, rotated it down, and subdivided that, so added the bevels, making sure it smooths reasonably well, and when I'm happy with it, add a mesh smooth to make that permanent. Mesh smooth, and now duplicate that for each sort of layer of panel. Instead of doing it manually, I decided to do it with the duplicate special option. I'm just experimenting with the distance, so in the translate setting there, I'm adding the distance I want it to duplicate to make sure it's nice and even and consistent, rather than trying to just eyeball it and hope for the best. Here I'm adding an extra bit of geometry just to help, or just to give me the topology that I need in order to extrude in the sort of, I'm not sure what you'd call that, the panel line, I guess, that indent in the back. Because of the way I made this by just beveling an edge loop and then pushing them out, a little bit of cleanup was necessary. It doesn't really matter exactly how you go about doing this. You could just use something like the poly draw tool and just go through and manually draw it, whatever, as long as you get the shape you need. Extrude that in, always remembering to scale, because it is needs to look like it has some depth in the orthographic viewpoint. Checking your smooth preview, so when that doesn't smooth well, insert some edge loops for control loops to make sure that looks good as a smoothed object. And that's come up quite nicely. So that's about done. The next thing, I wanted to delete the reference image and start with a new plane there that I can use to bake. I'm just making some minor adjustments to the positioning of the layout of the objects, but I'm ready to do some test baking to make sure this is working as I want it to. Okay, so I'll just create a plane. So I've deleted the image plane, I'm creating a new plane, which is what I'm going to bake the normal map onto. I'll slow down the video here back to 100% so you can see what settings I do. So This geometry in the front is the floating geometry that will be baked onto that 2D plane behind it. We'll just go into the rendering menu, lighting, shading, and transfer maps. Set the display to both, which gives us the envelope. We can see that red mesh there. Now I've just moved it all back a bit closer to the texture. It's very important that the red cage there is in front of everything, because that will project from the red cage onto the plane and capture everything in front of it. So I clicked on the normal map a second ago, the option for normal map, and I'm just going into the options on browsing to where I want to save the texture. Just make sure you can find where you're saving. Obviously you want to be working inside of a project in Maya. I like to use the letters NRM for normal in the extension, and I'm saving this as a PSD. Leaving it setting to new shader. Set the resolution. I've got it set to 1024, which is standard, world space, and a medium. So what happens here, this is after the edit. I've let it bake for a minute or two, whatever it took, and we can see the output from that new shader that's applied to this 2D texture. If I just hide the rest, you can see the output there. That's pretty good. It's quite a clean normal map, quite a nice effect, and that's more or less what we're after. Okay, so now we'll do an ambient occlusion pass. So I've gone back into transfer maps and selected the ambient occlusion option. Ambient. Now, once again, we just browse to where we want to save it. The thing about the ambient occlusion is it's a mental ray tool. So you have to make sure mental ray is active. If it's not, just go into your preferences in the plugins, plugin manager, and activate mental ray. Of course, that means in your transfer maps, if you scroll to the bottom, which I'll do just here, as it says, use mental ray common settings. So you need to scroll down, not the Maya common output, but the mental ray common output. So once again, I'm setting it to 1024 resolution. I'm just increasing the samples a little bit. I'm also needing to change the occlusion max distance. It's very important that we set some value there. Usually around 20 to 50 is fine. So after I've clicked bake, we come back. I've edited the video obviously, and what we're seeing here is a combination of the normal map and the occlusion. Sorry, it's just the occlusion map, ambient occlusion only. And you can see that's generated quite a nice result. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is add some extra details to the model. So here I've got essentially what will be a screw. So it's just a cylinder with and it's sort of line beveled in. Now I've just placed these around, and I'm currently going through and randomizing the rotation of them so that it don't all look the same. So I'm obviously speeding up the video here. It's pretty straightforward. So adding a few sort of bolty bits and pieces. Next thing I want to do is create something to fill in this big space here. So I'm just making a cube. So I've modeled a simple cube, and now I'm using the cut faces tool. Well, that's the insert edge loop, and now some cut faces to break this up and form just a bit of an interesting shape. Sort of a sort of random sci-fi kind of, general panel. I'm very much just improvising the shape here, not really following a reference. It's a fairly straightforward thing that I'm after. Using this multi-cut tool to quickly get the edge shapes that I'm after. And now just going through and deleting the extraneous bits, cleaning up some of the geometry, just merging the verts there. Here I'm just deleting these back faces so that I can easily select the edge loops on the outside, extrude those out, and then that lets me scale those out to create a bit of depth when I look at it in the orthographic view. A little bit of adjustment for these edges, just to make sure they come out. I'm happy with how far they come out. Cool, that's all I'm after for this shape. So now I've just duplicated it, moved it over to the other side and flipped it in the X, so scale X -1, and I've reversed the normals because it was flipped. I actually found out later in the video, you'll see that the normals I've incorrectly flipped, but I'll fix that when I get to it. Okay, so here what I want to do is create a bit of a grid, almost like a chocolate bar. Just sort of experimenting really for general shapes. So I've created a plane and divided that, I think it was 5 by 5, and then I've beveled those edges. And what I'm doing is selecting everything on the inside, all the inside major faces, and I'll extrude those out. Now I'll just slow down the video here. If I go to scale, you'll see they scale in local space. So what I need to do is go to transform components. So edit mesh, transform components. And in the channel box, once you've selected transform components, which I ended up hitting like 3 times then, go down to the local scale, X, Y, Z. And when you move those, that lets you scale them locally without them all sort of collapsing in on world space. So, I'm just going fairly quickly, but that's the general shape I'm after. Deleting those outside edges that I don't need. Now, in order to snap these together without duplicates, you need 2 of them deleted along there. And I've centered the vertex, the center point. If you hit insert on your keyboard, you can move the center point to the very edge of your model. And I've just turned on snapping. You can see the little magnet icon in the top, snap to point. And so that lets me quickly duplicate and snap them all together to form this large piece. And I've just combined that mesh, rotated it 45 degrees and brought them out. So that gives me kind of a grid-like metallic type shape. On reflection, I think I ended up with them being a little bit big, but it's good enough. I'm happy with it. So I'm just using the cut faces tool. Select all your faces and that lets you cut in any direction, anywhere you want. It's quite powerful. So I'm using that to create the ability to delete these outside edges so that I'm only seeing the grid inside that new shape that I've created. So sped this right up, using the lasso selection tool to quickly select the diagonals there. You can see a few bit of extra faces laying around, just delete those. Okay, so once that's done, flip it over, duplicate it and flipper it, reverse the normals. As we see when I bake, of course, those normals are acting a little bit weird. They appear to be correct, but they're actually flipped, which I'll demonstrate in just a second. So firstly, I'm just doing a bake, the same as before, the same settings. Baking from the low poly, using both. Almost no settings there. And we can see what I was talking about with the normals being a problem in the right. Now the problem there is that if we turn on the display face normals, you can see the directions on the left there are poking out, but on the right they're pointing inwards, which means the normals are flipped. So if I go normals reverse, they're now pointing outwards, even though they appear weirdly in the viewport. Same problem with these grid. You can see they're pointing inwards. So if I reverse those normals, they're now pointing outwards. That's unusual. It seems to be a little bug. They shouldn't be dark like that, but if we bake again and take a look at the result, after a quick edit to make baking look like a really quick process, we can see that that's actually generated quite a nice normal map. And finally, what I'm doing here is creating a color ID map. This is a bizarre looking thing inside of 3D, but it's really useful when we're in Photoshop because this gives us a quick selection set. I'll demonstrate that in the next video, but it's simply a matter of creating a new shader, just a Lambert shader. You don't want any specularity on it, with just a bright color, and throwing that color onto that shader onto the key aspects of your model. Because what we want is a texture map that will have a large selection of obviously different colors, which allows us to very rapidly select all of those objects inside of Photoshop. So we select the diffuse option, turn off our normal and ambient occlusion maps. We're not generating those again. We only need the one map. And straightforward. Saving it as a PSD, telling it where we want to save it, using the same naming conventions that we've been following. And here's the output. A very strangely colored map. We're not actually using it for the texture. Like I said, it's purely for quick selection, but it's quite a useful trick. Okay, in the next video, we'll go through texturing this.